Thank you all for coming tonight. I particularly want to thank the Fitchburg Senior Center for hosting us in this beautiful facility, and for FATV for providing the technical support and the videotaping. This building, this is a former Armory building, it's also the emergency shelter for Fitchburg. It's sort of fitting that we're having this Climate Connections event here. Some of us volunteered at this very facility 13 years ago during the ice storm, when we all tried to help each other out and do what we could to make it through that time here in the region. And so shelter's all about preparedness for disasters. We organize in advance to be ready, and then when those disasters happen, some of us just fall out of the streets and come in to help because we know we're needed. So time and time again, we see how our communities and our neighborhoods come together to address problems and find solutions to problems. So today, we're trying to come together now to not only help prevent future disasters and be ready the next time we have a major flood or a major rain event or another ice storm, but we also want to take the steps to help make our communities safer and healthier by making our connections here and learning how we can work together to make our future here in North Central Massachusetts healthier and safer for us all. We have a wonderful region. We are so blessed to have such beautiful natural areas in our region. We're the furthest east cold water fishery. We have forest, over 180 farms still active in our region. So these are all important things and all a part of climate solutions. We're also lucky to have a lot of local organizations already working in all these areas. I hope you had a chance to meet a lot of them today. I'd like to encourage all of you, and those of you at home who haven't had a chance, to think about how you might help. What is the one thing that you might do to help make a difference? Everything has a connection to climate and creating a healthier and safer future. So almost anything you like to do or want to do, you can find a place in the movement. So I do want to thank our sponsors tonight, the other sponsors, the Health Equity Partnership of North Central Mass, the North Central Climate Change Coalition, Citizens Climate of North Central Mass, New View Communities, Nashua River Watershed Association, In-Town Fitchburg, Growing Places, the North County Land Trust, Keep Fitchburg Beautiful, Fitchburg Greenway Committee, the Twin Cities Rail Trail, the Fitchburg Trail Stewards, the Mass Sierra Club Forest Initiative, JUMP and Sprout Change. And I also want to thank Mass Audubon, the Mount Wachusett Community College Environmental Program, Mass NOFA, Eco-Nuclear Solutions, who also came today. To save time, we had our sponsors provide questions in advance that we have provided, that David is going to talk to Chief Hoffer and have a conversation with her based on the questions that the sponsors from tonight provided. So David Radu is a resident of Fitchburg. He's an engineer, and he's full-time. And in his spare time, he's also a leader for his church, his scouting troops, and he's been a volunteer with Citizens Climate Lobby for almost a decade. Climate Chief Hoffer is the first state-level climate chief in the nation. Most recently, she was acting general counsel and principal deputy counsel of the US EPA. More interestingly to me, she's also a former public school teacher and a goat farmer here in North Central Massachusetts. So I'd like to welcome them both.
Thank you very much, Carolyn, for that warm introduction, and thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We are here in North Central Massachusetts, outside of the Metro Boston region. And because we are a little further afield from Boston, there may be some climate-related topics that are germane to this region that might be different than what typically come up as part of kind of the conversation. So I'd like to start today by talking about the places and spaces that we are in. And my first question, can you talk a little bit, big picture, about how the Commonwealth is planning for adaptation and mitigation in communities like this, in rural areas and small towns around central and western Massachusetts?
Sure. Well, thanks. I just wanted to begin by thanking you, David, and thank you, Carolyn, for that warm introduction and for all the groups that put this event together tonight. I'm really happy to be here in Fitchburg. This is close to where I live. I'm in Barre, and so it's just it's a special joy for me to be here in Central Massachusetts tonight. So thank you all for having me. And our flagship municipal vulnerability preparedness program is really the way that we are addressing resilience in communities across the state. And it's a grant program that actually allows communities to, you identify the resilience issues that you're most concerned about. I'll give you a specific example. And then this grant allows you to do the planning that you need to address that concern. We will be rolling out the MVP, it's called the MVP for Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness, but the MVP 2.0, which will focus on implementation strategies and also help communities do a little bit of capacity building that might not be in place. So for example, out in the western part of the state, in Egremont, they did a very interesting one. During COVID-19, they noticed, like a number of communities out there was an influx of people coming from urban areas to sort of, get out of more COVID-dense areas. And I think it got people thinking a little bit about, this is a little bit of a prequel for what we might expect with climate change, because our area here in the Northeast and in New England generally is supposed to be a receiving area for migration. Some of that will be in-migration from other parts of the country that are less habitable, maybe the Southwest in particular, and some of it might be from other countries. So they started thinking about how could they best plan to address that migration over time. Because there are impacts on, you have additional people coming to use utilities, roads, public schools. So, what do you need to do to kind of get prepared for that? So that gives you an example of some of the things that you can do with this MVP program. And right now, 99% of municipalities across the state are engaged in the program. And we have regional coordinators that help folks engage with it effectively. So that's one really key way that we are thinking about it now.
And let me follow up to ask, is that MVP program something under the state's budget, or is that coming in with federal dollars from the Inflation Reduction Act?
So that's currently under our state budget, and we put in additional money in this year's budget to cover the expansion of MVP 2.0. And we're going to be funding 30 communities across the state in a first pilot round before it goes out to all. And some of the components that we've looked at to make it a little bit easier, it's got a very relatively easy application process. So it's a 10-question application form, and that's to really help all communities reduce the barrier to entry to be able to access this grant money. It's got a new virtual climate equity and resilience best practices training, which is focused on supporting municipal staff in learning about the regional impacts and accessing our available tools and resources. It's got technical support so that you can craft the most competitive application, and guaranteed funding to implement a seed project after completing training and resetting priorities. So we're trying to make this as user-friendly as possible, I think is the big takeaway, because we do recognize that a lot of municipalities, particularly in our area and west of here, don't necessarily have a lot of people at the local level who can devote time to this. There's a lot to do. And so there might not always be the resources that some of the larger cities and towns might have. So we're trying to address that by making this as easy as possible.
Fantastic. I really appreciate that acknowledgement that smaller communities, rural communities, don't necessarily have the knowledge or the tool set to be able to capitalize on the opportunities that are available. And I want to carry that forward because the Inflation Reduction Act, which passed as a federal bill last year, provided a large amount of funds that are now available, but there's still a need to connect the dots from those funds coming from Congress down to those local communities. So can you speak to kind of any mechanisms for those monies for connecting them into communities like we have here?
Yes, so first I want to tell you a little bit about the levels of funding that are going to be available, particularly for rural communities. And then I want to talk to you a little bit about how we're planning to work with municipalities so that we can assist in accessing these funds. So specifically for rural development, this is in subtitle C of the IRA, which you can access it online if you're interested in looking at it. Section 22001 provides $1 billion in funding to the Department of Agriculture for electric loans for renewable energy projects, including energy storage. So that's including for battery storage. Section 22002, $800 million for rural energy for America, which will be giving grants and technical assistance for underutilized renewable energy technologies. And then lastly, Section 22003 is $500 million for biofuel market expansion, and that's going to provide up to 75% of the cost of biofuel projects. And that will be more relevant for communities in the Midwest that do a lot of growing biofuel crops. But you get a sense of the scale of some of the funding that's available. And that's just some of the funding. So there's actually a bunch of money at DOE through the IRA that's available through the DOE Loan Program Office. There's soon to be released guidance from the Internal Revenue Service that will talk about all of the different tax credits that are going to be available, and those will be available for municipalities as well. And then there is a special tranche of money that will be coming through the Environmental Protection Agency called the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. We're still waiting for the final guidance on that as well. And that's $27 billion. $7 billion of that will go to solar projects specifically, and cities, towns, and cities, states, and tribes will be able to apply for those funds. And then there's $20 billion that will go through entities like CDFIs or local institutions, local lending institutions, or green banks then that will co-invest with states to do a variety of decarbonization projects. And what we've been most focused on in the Healy administration is thinking about what can we do with that money to extend. We've been discussing a green bank. I think that's probably no surprise to folks. The governor talked while on the campaign trail a lot about the benefits of a green bank. And so the concept would be for us to have our own green bank that we could then use to leverage private investment to co-invest with some of these EPA dollars to decarbonize buildings. So what does that mean? That means that you can think of it like Hamburger Helper for people who aren't familiar with this idea of a green bank. I mean, basically, it's a bank, so it's going to loan stuff out and it's going to get paid back with some return on investment. But the green bank can also help to, like the term is usually to de-risk, but to take the risk out of some transactions so that private money feels more comfortable coming in and investing. So like traditional banks, like maybe a Bank of America or something like that, would be willing to come in and invest with a state in a project like low income or affordable housing, electrification or insulation. So there's a lot of that needs to be done across the state. Traditional banks might be less willing to invest in those projects because they might have concerns about credit risk. Is that loan really going to get paid back? So if we come in with a green bank and we can do something like we can create a loan loss reserve, we can say, you know what, we're going to back this, and if there's a problem with the payback on it, we'll cover it. And so then, the lender might say, okay, that's de-risked enough for us. We'll come in and we'll co-invest with you. The other thing that we can do is do interest rate buy downs, so we can make loans a little bit more accessible for people who want to do things like insulate their homes or electrify their homes by installing an air source heat pump or a ground source heat pump. And I can tell you, I put them in my home. In the February when we got that crazy cold weather that came through and it was -17 out where I am with a -40 something wind chill, and my heat pumps performed really well through that whole thing. So these are strategies that we can use to stretch the dollars. It's like Hamburger Helper. So Connecticut has a green bank, just for an example. I don't know, it's how I think about it. So right now, it's called a leverage ratio, but basically the idea is like for every dollar that Connecticut is putting into clean energy investment, it's getting $7 additional of investment from the private sector. So that's a huge way to stretch our money for these investments. So these these are our ideas for how we'll be able to go after just that one, group of, that one tranche of dollars that's going to be going through the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund at EPA. So there's actually so many different sources of funding right now. I've just told you about a couple of them. It's a little complicated. So there's actually a small grant that's coming out that should land in July, and all states are eligible for it. It's formula funding, which means that it's not competitive. Every state that wants it will get it. And that's just to really help us plan for how we can most effectively make use of these dollars, because there are ways for certain projects where you can bring in the tax credits and maybe some of this Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund money, and maybe there'll be a way to pair it with some funding from DOE, so that this will be, the big point is, it is a transformational amount of money to really help us move the clean energy future, make it a reality. And we've not had that level of investment before. If you track this, if any of you read Bloomberg NEF and you watch what's happening with the renewables market, you will know that 2022 was a record high worldwide for renewables investment. So it's really, really good news. It was the highest record investment around the world in solar and in wind. The not so great news, maybe you can guess, what country do you think led the pack in terms of investment in renewables? Does anybody want to venture a guess? Somebody said it, China. So 55% of global world investment in renewables is China. So that should be us. And Massachusetts can really lead the way in this. We have the smarts here. We know how to do this, and we're very, very good at innovation. So we want to be moving toward that, and we want to get the U.S. is the second on the list, the second largest single investor in renewable technology next to China. But this kind of money allows us to kind of, you want to say cooking with gas, except that's a phrase we don't want to use anymore. But it really does allow us to make that kind of momentous transformation.
Yes, we definitely want to be cooking with electricity. You are right on there. And that brings me to my pointed follow-up to you, which is, I have heard you talk about the Green Bank before, and I am so excited about it. The picture is great. So then the question is, what does the rollout look like from here? Do we need legislation? Do we have the executive mechanisms in place? Like, what is the pathway between here and a day when we can go to a Green Bank and get those loans?
So I can't quite talk about this just yet. But what I can say is look for some new developments in about 2 weeks, and watch the news around this topic.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Sometimes our timing is a little off, but I'm excited for the teaser of what's coming down the road.
Yeah.
So let's carry on with one other local question here. And you alluded to this a bit earlier. Grant programs for local communities, they can be fantastic for providing funds, but they also come with complexity. There's complexity to apply to them. They often trigger kind of making new mechanisms for doing stuff, as opposed to leveraging programs that may already exist in the community. So how are you thinking about programs that keep the burden low, that folks can engage in and then be able to sustain over time?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And it makes me realize there's a point that I should have made in response to your last question. So I want to quick address that and then move to this, which is that we're really hoping to be able to provide technical assistance to municipalities to pursue some of those federal funds. And it's kind of related to this question, because it's great that the money is there, but if your primary concern is, you've got one truck and you've got snow to clear in the wintertime and there's not many employees there, it's hard to figure this stuff out. So this is a real, it is something the governor asks me about every single time we meet. What is happening with municipalities and how are we going to be able to help them go after these dollars? So I just want to emphasize that. And then in specific response to David's question, we are sensitive to this issue too. And having worked in a nonprofit and seen sometimes the requirements around grant applications and reporting obligations, it can be a lot, and it can draw energy away from the central task at hand. So we do have community liaisons that support municipal staff. So that's something that we already do now and can do with this Municipal Vulnerability or MVP program, for example. So that's something that's available to you. And then we've also tried to work with communities to help them leverage community support themselves to do projects. So this might even be volunteer, and I want to give you 2 concrete examples so you'll understand what I'm talking about. There was in Ayers and Devons, they wanted to put in a pocket forest. So this was, basically like a small pocket park. So the local DPW and over 100 volunteers helped to prepare the site. They all worked together to do it, and they installed this forest pocket project. Another was Milford had a town park green stormwater infrastructure. So this is a way that they wanted to be dealing, maybe you've heard of these referred to as blue infrastructure, but this is a way of managing stormwater using basically nature-based solutions. So that's what Milford wanted to do. And the local highways and park staff installed and learned to maintain rain gardens and an underground storage system, like I assume it was some sort of a detention basin to reduce flooding in town and then in the Charles River itself. So these are ways that we can, kind of help municipalities think about strategies. You might not have the man or woman power to get it done, but we can also help you think about how to engage that or be resourceful so that you can do some of these things that are really cool. Basic traditional, you probably know more about this than I do, but traditional stormwater management, it's like highly engineered and it's not necessarily going to be restoring the watershed in some instances. And so something like this, it requires a little more maintenance to do a rain garden. But it can also be a really lovely way and a way that has many, many co-benefits, even in terms of health benefits, to deal with a stormwater problem. And so training people who can kind of own that and be a part of it is something that we can help you think about.
Well, I think we've covered a fair bit about the community level. And in our theme of places and spaces, I want to pivot a little bit to look at this kind of geography that we're in and the natural resources that are available. So the state Clean Energy and Climate Plan, 2025 and 2030, relies on preserving forests and working lands, the carbon that's already stored in them in order to meet its goals. We're lucky here to have a lot of intact forests and other kind of natural resources that are good carbon sinks. But there's a challenge, which is that many of the communities here have pressure from developers because they need the dollars that can come from developing those lands. So how does the administration think about ways to help ensure that those communities that have kind of these natural resources they're stewards of are able to actually keep protecting those lands and not kind of converting them into housing or other kinds of development?
So this is a great question, again, and this is something that's been a topic of a lot of consideration in our first 5 months. I wish I had this graph for you, but I will try to help you visualize it. If you sort of look here, and we're going across the x-axis here, and we were looking at getting to zero or net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Okay, it would look something like this. And this is where we get with just the reductions in, like increases in energy efficiency, cleaning up the energy grid, transportation, building sector. And this would be net zero. So what gets us there, this little extra part, is exactly what David's talking about. It's the natural and working lands. So that means forest preservation, preservation of wetlands, preservation of coastal salt marshes, because those things are effectively acting to capture carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and then sequester it. So it's really important that we preserve forest. It's really important that we consider expanding state-owned forest, and it's really important that we have very stringent protections in place for our wetlands and our coastal resources. So we've been thinking about that and thinking about how are we going to balance that with the need for more land for some of the clean energy that's also required, whether that's, largely that's solar when we're talking about it, but sometimes, it's for larger scale battery installations. I don't know if you all have seen This is maybe 3 weeks ago now. The Washington Post actually did a really great piece on this about the land that's required across the country to build out the solar and wind that we need. So this raises some land use conflicts. And as David noted, for municipalities, it can be very tempting because you're getting some of the revenues, the tax revenues that come in when these developers want to put these installations in place. So a couple things that we are doing. Secretary Tepper, who is the Secretary of the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, which oversees all of the Department of Environmental Protection, and the Energy Facility Siting Board is in there, and DCR is in there, and MDAR is in there, like just about everything that you think of when you think of environment, has announced she's going to be establishing a siting commission that's going to bring together folks who are interested in this across the state so that we can really have a more rational siting process. We have not done a particularly good job in considering things like environmental justice when we're building energy infrastructure, and you all might be familiar with some of the projects that have been in the news. So we want to do a better job of that. And so some of that is going to be figuring out ways to really incorporate those perspectives, and not just in a procedural way, but to really take them into account and maybe make different decisions. And some of it is going to be about figuring out where can we put all of the energy that we need to build out, and how do we balance that with the need to preserve, particularly our forests. So that's one thing that's going to be happening. And then we will also have forthcoming a package soon to be announced as well on the forest side that I expect will include things like increased incentives for private landowners to keep their land in forest. Right now, as well as I do, many of our neighbors, if you have maybe you have a kid to put through college, or maybe you have another need, and one easy way to do that, if you have a wood lot, it's reasonable to harvest and sell that wood. So it's going to be important to have other economic incentives that actually reward people who want to keep their forest standing. So those are some things that we're thinking about. We're also very eager. Harvard Forest is going to be coming out with effectively a solar potential study soon that I think is going to provide some insight into how we can maybe build out a lot of the solar infrastructure while at the same time preserving our forested lands. So we're very eager to see that. And then we have an additional solar potential study coming out from the Department of Energy Resources soon. So this is very much on our minds. It's a tricky issue, but it's one that we're really committed to making sure that we've got a lot of community buy-in for whatever direction the administration takes.
Well, I don't envy you that challenge, because you're right, it is truly a tricky issue. And it's tricky at the state level, but also at the local level, because individual communities need to make those kinds of decisions. So kind of stepping back a little bit, if part of the need with forests is truly to have like indefinite storage, right? Really preserving that land because we can't afford to lose the carbon associated with it, are there any plans or mechanisms under your existing executive authority, under other kinds of mechanics at the state level to like permanently preserve certain sectors of land or tracts of land to remain as forest in perpetuity?
Yeah, there are tools for doing that, and you're making me think of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is like the essential international law that governs, when you hear about these Conference of the Parties that happened in Egypt or Glasgow, those are meetings that take place as a part of implementation of the Framework Convention. And that's the way that we get, or we try to move different countries, where we all work together to try to come up with a plan to address climate change. So there are some basic sort of protocols in that for ways that offsets, for example, are a concept where, if a country wants to reduce its emissions and it can't for some reason get to the particular level that it has committed to, there's the concept of purchasing an offset, which basically means you will pay someone else to make that reduction for you. So offsets is a concept that you've probably heard about a lot. Many corporations use it. Corporations might have voluntary emission reduction obligations where they want to get to a certain level of emissions reductions, but they can't eke all that out of their own operations right now, so they buy an offset. You might have heard a lot of criticisms of offset markets because they are sometimes difficult to verify, or they might drive behavior like, raising, I think some examples have been, you are raising tropical forest in one location and planting other forest, and then sort of counting those emissions reductions associated with the growth of the new trees, and that's not the kind of thing that we want to encourage. So the good thing that comes out of the framework are these concepts around additionality, permanence, and verifiability. So when we do an offset, we want to make sure that it is permanent, verifiable, and additional. And so those kinds of concepts can help inform the types of decisions that you're talking about. So when we do set aside a forest, because we are counting on that as one way that we're going to get to net zero by 2050, and now we know each other well enough that you understand what this scribble means, that needs to be permanent, and it needs to be verifiable, and it needs to be additional. It has to kind of fit the mechanism, or else it's not worth it. We can't just say, okay, we're going to expand this forest over here, and we hope that kind of stays in place for the next 20 years. Because at that point, we really need to count on it to be working to draw down carbon, or we're not going to get to net zero. So it's very important that we take those things into account when we are doing further preservation.
Well, and to piggyback on that, there's an opportunity when planning to not only support the forest, but the ecosystems that go with it as part of like the 30 for 30, preservation of lands initiative and biodiversity initiatives. So it's good that you all are thinking about how, what those mechanisms look like to maintain that perpetuity component. I want to pivot from here, again, in the theme of spaces. We've gone from the outdoor world, let's take it to the indoor world. So you have talked in other conversations about kind of the older building stock of the state, and in particular some of that older building stock being owned by the state, and the challenges of retrofitting those kind of buildings. So how are we doing, and what can we do, what is your office doing to try and increase the pace of adoption of weatherization, of heat pumps, of those other tools that we know work? It's just a question of getting them out there.
Yeah, so we're doing a lot in this space. First of all, we're trying to get our hands around what it looks like. There's about 2.5 million units of just housing in Massachusetts, and it's all of different ages, different heating systems, different costs associated with retrofitting it. And to be realistic, if we're thinking about all the buildings in the state, not just residential, there are some where it really isn't going to make sense to do a deep energy retrofit. It's just not going to be worth the money to do that. There are some where it's going to make a lot of sense to do some work on the building envelope, some efficiency measures, and that's probably what we're going to do. There are others where it's going to make sense to do building envelope, deep efficiency, get an air source heat pump in there, and there are some where we might be thinking if it's a more densely developed area, maybe we will have things like networked geothermal or ground source heat pumps. So there's different ways of getting to where we're moving, but the point of all of this is to get to electrification. So when we sometimes refer to decarbonization of the building sector, it basically means shifting away from fossil-based home heating systems over time to electric ones. Now, that only works as an emissions reduction strategy if you are also decarbonizing your energy grid at the same time. So that means the power has to come from stuff like offshore wind, from solar. We need the storage to back that up. We might be looking at other sources over time. But that's really important because if you make this shift to electrification, like right now, for example, we throw this light switch on, about 60% of the electricity in the state now is still coming from natural gas-fired power plants. So, when I run my heat pumps now, I'm an early adopter. It's better than what I had before, but it's going to be a lot better when that grid is cleaned up, and then the heat pumps are using electricity that's actually cleaner. So that's where we're heading with building decarbonization. And the question about how are we trying to accelerate that process? this is a very complicated question. I'm not avoiding it. I just want to tell you a little bit about why this is so hard. Right now in this state, and I don't know if any of you know people who are in high school, but we have a chronic shortage of electricians. And those are the folks we need to do the work like heat pump installations, HVAC work. So we need that. We have the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center as a quasi-governmental agency. They've just done a study. We're about 30 to 40,000 workers short for all the stuff we need for the clean energy transition. So that's everything. That's, engineers, that's people to build the wind farms, that's people to do the PV installations. It's across the board. It's the people who's going to design, coastal resilience projects. So it's a lot of workers that we need to get this done. So when I go home at night and I worry about what's happening, I'm not so worried about the technology anymore. I'm worried about having enough people to do the work, and I'm worried about having enough money to get the job done. So the workers is one thing. So we have to address that issue. We have put together a cross-agency team of our Labor and Workforce Development Secretary, Lauren Jones, Secretary Pat Tutwiler, who has just created an innovation pathway, which is, he's our education secretary, and so it means that there's going to be a special emphasis on clean energy in the public schools. So, it's a way of investing so that we actually have heat pumps for the kids to work on and learn how to repair them and how they work. So we just did that. We've also brought our Economic Development Secretary, Secretary Howe, into that discussion, and Secretary Tepper. So working together to try to figure out how we're going to do this. So that means we're in a lot of touch with the labor unions. We're in contact with, other energy service companies who can come and work with us and might be willing to train people. So that's a big part of what we're doing to try to accelerate it. Green Bank will help accelerate some of the financing for this work. But some of you may also know that during the Baker administration did a terrific job putting together a Clean Heat Commission. And that Clean Heat Commission made several recommendations. If you haven't had a chance to read it, it's definitely worth just reading the executive summary, because it's an excellent piece of work. And it was an unusual group of bedfellows who were all in agreement about what these recommendations should be, which is remarkable. And one of them was to do a clean heat standard. And that's essentially, if you follow this stuff or you know what a low carbon fuel standard is, it's basically a way of crediting over time the reductions in fossil fuel use for home heating. So homeowners would actually get credits for switching to electric air source pumps, and those would have a monetary value to them. And we're working on developing that now. We are also working on having a clearinghouse was a recommendation. I don't know if any of you ever tried to do rebates or get rebates through Mass Saves. Okay, so it's not the easiest thing in the world, I think. I don't know what your experience was. Maybe you had a really good experience with it. I myself have a hard time figuring out the website. So the idea would be, Vermont has something called Vermont, it's VEIC, Vermont Energy Something Corporation, but it was its own separate entity, and it didn't matter. It didn't matter if you were coming in because you wanted to work on your heating system or your electric. They were going to help you with it, and it was a one-stop shop, and then they would also help you think about how to finance it. So the idea from the Clean Heat Commission was to have a clearinghouse where you could go and say, I want to put solar panels on, and I want to get air source heat pumps, and I want you guys to help me figure out how that gets done and how to finance it. One stop. Easy. So that's the idea that we want to help advance here, and we're working on that clearinghouse now as well. So I think that's a combination of things that we can do where the state can kind of come in, do some projects to get the building sector decarbonized, begin to put the workforce together, and then also work on making things more accessible to residential homeowners who just want to kind of start to get these projects done themselves.
Well, I can speak from experience and say we got our home weatherized recently and got the bill, and then afterward realized we qualified to not have to pay the bill. So the good news is we don't have to pay the bill. The bad news is we found out afterward because it was indeed complicated to navigate. And simplifying those systems will definitely help. Now, earlier you mentioned the fact that there is this 30 to 40,000 worker gap. Now, the glass half full side of me hears that and says, jobs, jobs, jobs. Yes. There's a real opportunity space there. One of our sponsors tonight put in an interesting question to flow your way, which is, could something like a civilian conservation corps mechanic, or like a Teach for America an analog, that would take folks coming out of college, give them some way to help offset the cost of college and get them into those career tracks, is that something that might be possible to help build up that workforce and get people going along the direction for those jobs that we need?
So this is a great idea, and you probably know more about this than me, but I think this was actually being originally considered in the original Infrastructure Act. Was, at the federal level was the creation of this Conservation Corps idea. But we do like this idea. We have talked about it. I don't know where that would fit in a first year, probably not, given what we've taken on to achieve, but we very much like the idea and think that it could be a really good way to engage. One thing it does make me think about, two things that popped into my mind, random. I also drive an electric vehicle, and I always go to Salvador Chevy to service it. And there's not many EV repair people in the state yet. And I mean, they're terrific, but I am really nice to that man because he's very, very busy. So it makes me think too, like there's really a need for folks to be doing that kind of work also, because we're supposed to have, 1 million EVs on the road pretty soon, and that means we're going to have, people who can help us repair them. So that came to mind as well. As I think in my personal experience, that's a huge job opportunity. I would love there to be more EV repair people. But the other thing your question made me think about is young people, and talking to them a lot and talking to them about, not just jobs, but if young people, at least the folks I'm talking to, and there's one of them here tonight, they're really concerned about our future, and they're experiencing, a lot of anxiety and a lot of despair about climate. And I've been very inspired about the incredible poise and engagement of many of these groups of young people across the state. And as a result of, hearing from them, we have established a Youth Climate Council. And I am hoping that through that is part of the way that we can get out to more high schools and start talking to people about some of these job opportunities too. And also to really have them at the table. All these decisions that we're making, that's our constituency. Those are the people who are going to live with all these decisions and ideas that we're talking about today. And so that's really important to us and important to the administration too.
So that brings me to my second to last question, which is that your office is truly unique among all the states in that it was kind of started first day of the Healey administration by an executive order to make an office that is cross-cutting, that goes across all the departments and looks at the kind of holistic view of how the state is going to manage climate change. And so many of the things that we've talked about today, there are multiple problems that intersect together. So as an example, we want to electrify, but we need workers, and then there's an education piece that comes with that. We want to manage forests, but that means that we need to have financial incentives, and maybe there's a green bank component that goes with that, right? There's interconnections between these. So in that context, kind of how does your position let you look at those problems in a way that sees all these interconnections and bring different players together that may not have been kind of natural bedfellows before they were brought in by your group?
So that's probably the best description of my job I've heard yet. And it's really, what people today would call intersectional. It's really being at the place where you're there's lots of people thinking about transportation, lots of people thinking about buildings, lots of people thinking about the grid, and there's not that many people who are thinking about how does all that stuff fit. So I just want to turn to one example because we've been talking a lot about buildings tonight. So when you think, okay, this is great, we're going to have some money to finance the buildings, and we've got that together, and we're going to find some workers to do it, and we're getting started on this. And there's another layer to it, which is that we have a lot of congestion on our distribution grid. So that's, like the local poles and wires that bring all the electricity to our homes. We need to do a lot of work on that to get it ready for all this electric demand. We're going to at least be doubling our electric demand as we move to electrification. And there are some estimates that it will be more than a doubling. So that means a lot of stuff, like substations and more power lines, and making sure that the system can really handle that. So that's another layer where you have to be thinking about, okay, well, where we're citing these housing projects to start out with, for example, we just want to make sure that we're not overloading a particular part of the distribution grid. So that's conversations with utilities, for example, and it also means thinking really hard about reducing demand, because we might not, be in a position to wait that long for the build out of all of this stuff that we need to do on the distribution grid. We want to also be thinking about strategies to reduce power usage overall. So the way that we bring people together who haven't typically thought about these things, it's really structural. If you look at the executive order, which was the first thing that Governor Healy did, and first official act as governor, it establishes these things called Secretariat Climate Officers. So what is that? It's a framework where there is now a person, a Secretary Climate Officer. These were all existing employees, they're not new hires, but there are people who had, were very familiar with the agency mission and had an aptitude to work on climate change. They are the people in each of the secretariats now, whether it's, public safety or technology services, which has relationship to climate, believe it or not, Health and Human Services, education, whatever the secretariat is, it now has a person responsible for working with our office on climate things. And they develop a plan. Some of the agencies have statutory mandates that flow from the Global Warming Solutions Act, and so I should probably just say that this Clean Energy and Climate Plan that we've been talking about tonight that sets our emission reduction goals out through 2030, 2040, and 2050, that's driven by statute. That statute was passed in 2008. We were one of a handful of states that had an economy-wide emissions reduction statute in place in 2008, leading the pack. Well, why is it that here we are in 2023 and we still have much work to do? That statute drives the development of the Clean Energy and Climate Plan. You have to do a new one every 5 years. There's just a new one that's been completed at the end of the Baker administration. It's quite good. But if not everybody is owning it, it can't happen. And you see this happen at the federal level too, where emissions reductions was largely the job of the Environmental Protection Agency. And so you saw things like the Clean Power Plan, you saw that effort to try to, bring emissions down. But if you don't have DOT, if you don't have DOE, if you don't have the Department of Defense, if you don't have Housing and Urban Development also making those efforts, you're not going to hit your emissions reductions. So President Biden came in, he established an Office of Domestic Climate Policy. That's what Gina McCarthy, another New Englander, ran Mass DEP, went to run along with David Hayes and Ali Zaidi, and that was the first federal level to do that. And we have a robust version of that at the state level. This executive order actually gives the Climate Office some authority to direct agency actions if they're not sufficiently reducing their emissions reductions. So that's kind of the structural way that it works. But then there's all the people stuff. And that's where it's really important to build those relationships of trust. We meet as a cabinet on climate every single month. We get together and we meet. And we also are learning from each other. I can come in and as I did, my first meeting with them, I did a presentation on climate science. This is what this means. This is where we are right now. We can't reverse the amount of heating that we have, the warming that's occurred. That's locked in for the foreseeable future on the order of centuries. But what we can absolutely do and must do is reduce our emissions across the board now, because every 1/10 of a degree really, really matters. So that means it really, really matters that we have transit that people feel like they can use, and not just in the Boston area. It really means that we've got to get cars electrified. It really means that Health and Human Services has to start thinking about ways to address heat events, that we're ready for storms, that we know what we're going to do when we see incidents of disease increase, that we know what's going to happen when we see increased levels of ozone and that drives asthma events, particularly for children during high heating. So it's getting consciousness raised about all these issues, because we've got people who are extremely expert in their areas of focus, but they may not, just like me, I'm not an expert on labor and workforce by far. So I'm getting educated by my colleagues about that so that I can be more effective in thinking about that in the context of these climate jobs that we were just talking about. So we're learning from each other. We're building that ability to get work done together as a team, and that's probably one of the most important aspects of this, is really operationalizing de-siloing. For those of you who have worked in government before, you know that it tends to be pretty stovepiped, and so the people who do the people who do the budget are over here, and the people who do the climate are over here, and they never meet. This year I sat in on all of our capital investment plan meetings. So to put a state budget together, a capital budget, we have these capital improvement plans that we do, and those go through vetting, and then the budget is ultimately brought to the governor for her approval. So, I was the person in the room saying, oh, okay, we're gonna buy a vehicle. Well, is that gonna be an electric vehicle? Because we've got an executive order that says it's supposed to be an electric vehicle. So starting those kinds of conversations. And our administration and finance staff led the way in saying, hey, we should make sure that all of these investments are consistent with our clean energy and climate plan. And they mastered that plan. So there's an incredible amount of cross-pollination that's happening in this space, and that's very exciting. And I feel there was a bit of a pent-up demand for it. You never know, people are going to be welcoming or not of this concept. And I think it was very heartening for me personally to come into this role and start getting phone calls saying, hey, we work in procurement. There's 10 ideas that we have about how we can drive green purchasing. When can we talk to you? And I thought, geez, this is fantastic. And so there's really been a lot of that.
So to wrap up for tonight, you mentioned the fact that the mechanisms that you're engaging with right now relate back to a 2008 bill that 15 years later, right, we're seeing the fruits of those policies come to life. So you are in the, some could say unenviable, others could say enviable position of being able to see what the future might look like from here, what 10 years or 15 years out looks like. So what is something that gets you most excited? Like something that, as you look at your job, what is something that folks may not know about that you are like, this is something that is awesome, that is coming to the future of Massachusetts?
There's very many things. Look, this moment is fraught in a lot of ways, right? I think we all kind of look at it and it's daunting. I just laid out a bunch of stuff. Maybe you've thought about it before or not, but you kind of scratch your head and go, oh, wow, that's a lot, right? And it's not, then you think, okay, well, even if Massachusetts does it, there's all the other states. And even if the United States does it, there's, all these other countries. So there's a heaviness to it. And also feel like in all my time working in this space, I have never seen people so excited. I have never heard the frankness of the conversations. I have never seen so much, acknowledgement across different sectors that we have really got to do something. And so that's super inspiring to me. And I also feel like, to the extent that the moment feels daunting, it holds that much possibility. And so I'm really looking forward to it. What gets me excited about this is that we really can achieve this goal. We don't have a lot of time to mess around, that's for sure, and we're behind. And I think it can actually be better. I think if we can get our ducks in a row, take advantage of this transformative level of funding that we see, really start to work differently together, people working together with our corporate partners, with all the stakeholders that sponsored an event like this tonight, if we can really change the way that we have worked in the past, I think we can do it, and I actually think it can be better. I think it can be more equitable. I think our health is going to improve. I think it's going to be better for our kids. I think it's going to be better in terms of what our living environment looks like. But there's a lot of consciousness shifting that has to happen in order to get there. So it's this moment where you kind of feel like there's so much potential in it, and it's a time for us to get very, very clear about who we want to be. a lot is going to change as a result of climate change and climate disruption. And so now is the time for us to really get back in touch with our values. And I think Massachusetts has always been a leader in this space. You know, we led in the movement to abolish slavery. We led in the movement for women's suffrage. We've led in many other ways. I could go around the room and you would all think about examples of this. And I think this is another place where we can really lead, and there's a value proposition and we know how to do it. So that's what gets me excited about it.
Well, I have to say, you mentioned in a previous interview that you were told to go big or go home. I am so excited about the big picture you are painting, and all of the people who are here in this room are excited to work with you. And hopefully the people joining at home as well are excited to put our volunteer time, our work time into this transformational project, which not only will help save the planet, but may lead us to better, more livable cities, cleaner air, more wildlife, all kinds of other benefits for the way that we live. So thank you so much, Chief Offer, for joining us tonight, and we can't wait to partner with you going forward.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for coming out.